So, all the news about the Activision Blizzard Microsoft deal kind of made me think about Wildcard, just out of left field acquisitions that kind of make a little bit of sense. So, first of them is Sony merging, not acquiring, with Nintendo. So this might seem a little weird, because Nintendo was very much against the whole Microsoft thing, and very much enjoys its status as an independent company, seemingly. But there are some reasons why they would let this happen, especially a merger and not just an outright acquisition. And there's also reasons why Sony would want this too. So for Nintendo, they've kind of made it very clear about their ambitions about being more than games, and just expanding their properties to other media, which we've seen with the Mario movie. And Sony owns Columbia and Sony Animation Pictures, so it's well within the possibilities for this new merged company to just make these movies in-house instead of having to rely on Illumination. Granted, I did have this idea before that movie made like well over $1 billion at the box office, and you might think they probably don't want to really risk changing things up if they have a formula that seems to work really well, which is fair, but on the other hand, they could also be thinking, wow, look at all the money these things make. Would be cool if we were doing this entirely on our own and keeping all of that money instead of, Illumination pocketing who knows how much and us just getting whatever license IP fee percentage, I guess. So they might take the risk of the next Nintendo movie not making as much money as the Mario movie did, just because they would, keep the money themselves instead of just giving it away to someone else. There's also, Sony's own music publishing company, which could be appealing to Nintendo, considering they could just use that to get things like their game soundtracks onto streaming services and make money from that, when presumably they don't, because there isn't really that much money to begin with, so splitting it with the music publishing, after going through all the trouble of just figuring out, the actual rights related to the actual composer, I guess, of the songs. Just getting rid of, a kind of middleman with a publisher like that would potentially make this actually worth doing, with the kind of low percentage Spotify kind of gives out for this stuff. And I think it is really worth emphasizing the difference in this kind of merger compared to something like an acquisition with Microsoft, where they would kind of just be lost in just all these different divisions and basically have to put up with whatever whim Microsoft decides. Like the whole firing Bethesda employees in the last year of just trying to get Starfield finished, which is still crazy to me that happened. Gaming is the most profitable part of Sony. They kind of have leverage of just the main moneymaker to basically just do what they want. And it'd be like that to an even greater extent with Nintendo, kind of part of Sony. Gaming would have all the power as, by far the biggest moneymaker, because, it would be even more of a situation where the company lives or dies depending on how good the gaming division is doing. And it already kind of is like that, look what happened with the PS3 era. And Sony kind of has also a lot of reasons to want this to happen, because Nintendo's kind of recent success is causing problems for them, just because game developers are focusing more on their console. Look what happened with Monster Hunter as a perfect example. For a while it was focused on the 3DS, but then with World it moved to the PS4 and it was a huge success. It wasn't exclusive, but it was still a big PS4 release. But then they just went back to the Switch when that ended up being popular and just was making games for that as either exclusives or timed exclusives. And then, similar thing happened with Atlas, where they were a big PlayStation developer with Persona, but then SMT was timed exclusive for Switch, and then there's a bunch of ports. Even Ubisoft now is making Switch exclusives, and the situation might get even worse for Sony if the Switch 2 comes out and is another success and is more powerful, so there's less kind of limitations or just difficulties with development, but it's still just a lot cheaper to make games for, and that's very appealing for developers. And Sony should be aware of this, because a similar thing happened with the PS3 and the PSP, where there was just a ton of studios just making things like spin-offs for the handheld, And of course, a little bit of that had to do with, the PS3 being kind of difficult to develop for, but, still, the whole problem of games being extremely expensive to make now is kind of potentially solved just by making smaller games for handheld. Now, there is the slight problem of, would regulatory bodies be okay with there only being 2 console makers? Which is kind of a legitimate question, but there is kind of a potential solution to that problem with my second idea. Ubisoft being acquired by Apple before they make a game console. So Apple was one of the companies that was floated around with EA, so they are definitely interested. And I'm kind of surprised that the Activision Blizzard Microsoft acquisition was the only thing like it kind of happening. Because tech companies are kind of dealing with an issue now of a lot of investors are kind of anxious about the kind of drop in revenue after the whole tech pandemic boom thing happened. So I'm kind of surprised that a lot of companies aren't kind of using the profit they made from that year or two to just purchase companies that are already profitable, because it kind of really, settles that anxiety of, we're actually, growing. Even if our core business probably is going to make that insane revenue we had before, it doesn't matter because we have this extra profit coming in from this new thing. Granted, Ubisoft's finances are kind of all over the place, but it's really because a bunch of stuff just ended up getting delayed, so they didn't really have much coming out for a decent financial period. Honestly, it doesn't really have to be Ubisoft, but I kind of think that just makes the most sense, because EA is kind of in a weird space where they lost the exclusive rights to FIFA, which was one of their big consistent moneymakers, and their other sports moneymakers are probably looking to see how the exclusivity deal goes. So their future's kind of very much in doubt, which is why they're looking to sell before. Why do I think a game console from them is kind of realistic? After all, this whole way it works of just not really making that much profit on the initial console, if any, and just making up money with games, stuff like that, isn't really how they like to operate. They're kind of, a hardware company. They like to sell expensive hardware and make money off of that. But if you think about it, that's kind of not really the full story, right? Like, they've made money selling things like iPhones and iPads, but then made a lot of money on services like the App Store after the fact. And this isn't really a new thing either, because they've been doing that for a long time with, iTunes and the iPod, and, iMacs and just a bunch of software for that. Like, this whole trend of game companies moving to things like services, if anything, has really kind of just moved that business closer to how Apple's operated with, again, things like iTunes and the App Store. Like, it's just moving into their domain, so it kind of really makes sense that they would do this. And they have one kind of big tool at their disposal that other companies like Xbox and Sony don't. They can make their own chips. They have been making their own chips. So they can literally just cut out companies like AMD and Nvidia by using their own designs to basically just actually, make decent profit on just the initial sale. They're also in a kind of unique position where they're kind of late-ish to this generation. So it doesn't really make sense for them to really go all out with like a super powerful thing. Like, they're the new console manufacturer, just kind of making something on par with PS5, which is cheaper to do now that it's been several years since that level of performance was basically reached at the price for the PS5. So that's just kind of another thing adding in the amount of profit. They aren't paying the tax for being near cutting edge the way that the 7nm PS5 was back in 2020. But the thing that kind of really makes this make a lot of sense is, since it's basically using the same design as things like Apple Silicon, well, that just means that their game console can be compatible with all the stuff that is already designed for their Silicon. Like, basically just day one, they could have the entire library of just iPad, iPhone, Mac, just on the console. Everything from just, mobile game stuff, like Candy Crush or whatever, to the things that are on Mac, like Hades and like Total War Warhammer games. WoW. Like, I feel like people kind of forget how much stuff is actually on Mac. Like, I literally just got a fan remake of a Disney MMO that got canceled in like 2013, I think, running on a Mac a little while ago. And they just announced a bunch of stuff coming to iPhone, like just Resident Evil, because of the kind of big jump they had recently. Just coming out of the gate with all that stuff is a unique tool that they have. And they could also just use that to just incentivize people to come over, because they could just always be like, yeah, even if this doesn't really work out, you could just use the game that you made for our console, even if it doesn't work, and just make a Mac version of it, or an iPhone version of it, considering that's apparently like a thing now. It's a useful, like, break last case of emergency way out they're kind of offering. This is also relatively minor, but I thought it was interesting how they're basically the only company that kind of like really refused to like lay people off from that previously mentioned like investor anxiety of revenue kind of falling. And I kind of have to wonder if that isn't because they know they're going to need a lot of engineers working on something, both hardware and software wise, big in a few years, like releasing a game console. Like, if they were just continuing kind of what they've been doing of just like iterating on the iPhone and the Apple Silicon Macs, then yeah, they kind of could have fired people to make investors happy, but they didn't, which I think is kind of interesting. In fact, the CEO even took a pay cut to avoid that. So it kind of makes me wonder if there is something cooking there. And I mean, yeah, they did have that VR thing, but that kind of sounds, from what I've heard about it, that it's basically been in like slow development for a while now, and a lot of the problems related to it were like the production side of things. So I wouldn't be surprised if it basically had been done for a while now, but they were just figuring out production issues with it, and really could have fired people if that was like the only thing that they had. Plus, this is kind of a small bonus, big reason why consoles are cheaper is kind of the economic of scale. Right, they're selling, millions and millions of these things, so it can be cheaper than things like a PC. But they can kind of tap into that in some unique ways because they aren't just making a console. Like, they could just take this chip, which is being made cheaply because it's, being mass-produced, and because it's possibly running on a slightly outdated manufacturing node, and just use it in, their Macs. Like, they don't sell an insane number of Macs. They don't get that same amount of economic scale normally, but, they could increase their profit margins by using something like this in a desktop. And now, the third one, kind of less interesting, but could possibly go somewhere. Sony acquiring EA partially. So as I stated, EA is kind of in an odd space because obviously they lost the FIFA exclusivity, like I said, and could lose more because like NFL is definitely watching how that plays out, which could be really bad for EA's kind of finances if they lose out on all these consistent yearly moneymakers for them. So they might consider kind of refocusing and also making some money in the short term to refocus by kind of just selling off some studios that haven't really been making them that much money recently. Now, the one I really had in mind was BioWare, but things have been kind of going not that great recently, with a lot of firings and speculation of development problems or whatever on their next Dragon Age game. I guess they could technically rehire them and try to get this game going, I guess in a more focused way, but there are other things like Respawn obviously has their Star Wars games that have had some iffy things related to them. To be honest, I was really thinking about BioWare in mind with this, just because they really fit kind of well with what Sony's been going for with these like big story-based single-player games, but it's a little bit different compared to a lot of the other stuff like God of War, because it's kind of more, strictly speaking, just a straight RPG versus the like action games with some RPG elements. So it's a decent difference, but still, again, the kind of story-heavy single-player games that they're interested in. Who knows, maybe if they actually buy this, they can really get it on track. And I assume they probably wouldn't spend that much, because I don't imagine EA is really valuing BioWare and its properties that much right now. I mean, there were never like massive sales successes, so maybe it's worth the gamble on Sony's end if they can actually get this studio kind of straightened out a little bit. I mean, I kind of didn't really think a lot of those leaks were as bad as people kind of made them out to be. It's like, oh no, they're kind of trying to make the warrior class combat not suck.
You need to leave! That is disgusting.
Like, I know there's kind of a perception in like the RPG community of like, oh, any attempt to make like the action gameplay more exciting means that everything else, like the story, is automatically worse. But I kind of never really bought too much into that, because it's, you know, different people writing the story as opposed to just, you know, programming the gameplay or whatever. I guess Respawn kind of is on the table now. Like, I don't know how well that last Jedi game made. I assume it's Star Wars. It probably made a pretty decent amount. But it was like next gen only, and the PC title was bad. So I don't know if they really made that much money off of this one compared to the other one. So it might just be like, oh, this is kind of going downhill, and who knows how trying to get that game on last gen consoles is going. So maybe just bailing and just selling Respawn could work. I don't know how, I guess transferring Star Wars would work, but I don't even know if that's really important. But maybe just focusing on something like, you know, another Titanfall game could be good. Or just like rebooting Killzone and basically just making it like a Titanfall knockoff could, I guess, work too. Or maybe Maxis. This kind of doesn't really make sense because Sony makes consoles, but God knows what EA is really expecting out of Maxis nowadays. So, you know, again, I think EA is kind of just, I mean, they literally were trying to sell the company. Like, they kind of were like, okay, we give up. Can anyone else take it from here? They're probably willing to just let, you know, Sony just swoop in, give them some money to figure things out, and then they just like move on. Just, you know, sell something that makes a game every 4+ years to get something going that makes the kind of yearly revenue like sport games that they want. You know, just stable annual revenue to replace what you're losing, or at risk of losing, I guess.